Well, welcome to the Pivot to Pasture podcast. I'm Kirsten Simons, and I'm your host for today. And we had a guest who watched one of our webinars. Pamela watched our Pivot to Pasture introduction presentation, and she wanted to know more about biodynamic gardening. So thank you, Pamela, for asking. So we invited our resident expert here today to talk about this, Christopher Simons. Chris, thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedule to come on and talk about biodynamic gardening.
Of course, family first.
Awesome. So before we really get started, I want to remind people that it really helps this channel grow if you subscribe for all the new content we have scheduled. We've got a lot that is coming down the pipeline. And make sure you smash that like button for each session that you watch. We're building our tribe right now, so please also share on social media. Now, Chris, you have had an incredible career as a chef already. You started back when you were 9 years old, and I want to first touch base on a few highlights from your career. And then I want to jump pretty quickly to our topic for today, which is about biodynamic gardening. So may I share
Yeah,
just a little bit about the cooking experience that's on your resume?
and please.
Awesome. I think that'll be really helpful for people to know that you really do know great food. So, and you know what you're
And
talking.
that's what and it's an important thing to kind of talk about as we whittle our way into the biodynamics of it, because I really took this as a chef approach to gardening, not just being an agronomist or a market gardener. I really was able to see the effect of the garden and the impact that it has in the kitchen, which is really, I mean, we're going to talk about that more in detail, but this is the spark really, to fuel that fire that I ended up getting for gardening, and especially biodynamic gardening. We'll go into more detail, but my career started at 15, and I was working at a fine dining Italian restaurant. I actually started out in pastry first, but that gave me the 3 years of fine dining that was required to go to the famous Culinary Institute of America in New York, and I was there for 2 years. I graduated. I actually went back to the place that I had first learned. I mean, I went back to the fine dining Italian restaurant, and that was my first lesson of like moving forward. You have to just keep going and pushing yourself forward. Don't get comfortable and don't go back. Because when I did, it was actually a little bit of a nightmare. The
Mm,
chef was on his way out, and I can sense that the soul of the place, which really is the chef, a lot would say, it was starting to just die out. So it was not a good move to go back. And so I realized that I had to keep kind of progressing the knowledge and the craft. Because when I went in there, I started out as a junior sous chef, and I think that was another lesson learned of moving too quickly. So I ended up moving to Washington and working at a French restaurant called Campagna. We made everything in house. It was a wonderful French bistro right in Pike Place. I started to feel the city life and also what it takes for even a small restaurant to do everything by hand. It's an incredible feat, and I was there for 2 years. I loved it until I had gone back to New York to work with Ian Scully at the Maidstone Club in East Hampton. Now, before you think, oh, East Hampton, hoity-toity, it was 2009. The recession was in its peak. People were losing their jobs left and right, especially in my industry. I really wanted something comfortable, but not comfortable, but I needed something. And it was actually a win-win because Ian ended up being the greatest mentor of my life, aside from my parents. I mean, he took me under his wing, and I was with him for 5 years. And I got to learn the craft on a very high level, He was like an unsung hero in the industry, had worked in 3 Michelin his entire life, the Connaught Hotel being one of them, Chateau de Bagnols. He was at the Ritz in London, and he just had this incredible pedigree and charisma about him. And in those 5 years, he gave me everything, you know. But again, chef's appetites are insatiable. We constantly need to be learning something, doing something. And he was actually the one that pushed me out. He's like, it's time to fly from the nest. And I love that about him. I love that that was the conclusion to his mentoring, was that he was the one who pushed me out. And I wanted to work for this restaurant. I only wanted to work for one guy, one restaurant to rule them all. It was Manresa Restaurant, ran by David Kinch. And there was a book that just came out about him and about his restaurant. He and I are torn from the same cloth, and I've never even met the man. I can just tell through the reading and his philosophy of food, we're in line. And he had a biodynamic farm supply his restaurant,
Mm.
and this is where it all started. So here I am moving away from New York, going into something new, really, really just looking to get into Manresa. Now, they weren't hiring at the time. So the loophole that I took was that they, 60% of their product came from this biodynamic farm called Love Apple in the foothills of Santa Cruz. And I ended up actually getting an internship there. One of the caveats of working as an intern, if you're also a chef, that you get to do what's called a stage, which is to go into the restaurant and learn from it while working, your butt off for it. But you get this depth of knowledge, and it's really an awesome, pro quo. So I was, working at Manresa a few times while working at Love Apple, and I realized, so Love Apple is one of the most beautiful farms on the planet. And Cynthia Sandberg is her name. She was actually a lawyer turned biodynamic gardener, and got a hold of this land that was actually once a winery, and it was owned by like Circus Brothers as well. There's an interesting story about how she acquired the land, but it was extremely steep. It was so she had to terrace it, and on top of that, she had a really really bad gopher problem. So she realized that instead of being kind of field grown and having like a fixed bed out in a field, or working out of a greenhouse, that she would do raised bed. So she had 180 redwood, okay, redwood raised beds.
Wow.
You can imagine the expense, but redwood is the best in terms of its degradation,
Longevity.
and soil contact and longevity. Yeah. Without having to use obviously pressure treated, which is you can't use in this setting. So it was amazing to see 180 different cultivars. It was just amazing to see this variety, and I have never seen anything like that in my life. I mean, as a chef, we are it's like we're almost like robots. I mean, we were working with the same, 20 ingredients my entire career. I mean,
Mm.
you could there was a couple things here and there that were different, especially in New York. I mean, Long Island, it's the produce and the fish out there is some of the best on the planet. But tomatoes and salmon and bass and filet mignon and strip and spinach and potatoes. You have these like basic things that you can do a lot with in food.
You're making me
But it
hungry.
was, yeah, right. But I want to make you starving here shortly, because I mean, I started, walking through this garden, and she really encouraged us to taste. And
I was tasting like arugula flowers for the first time.
Mm,
Or, the fact that like a dill flower and a parsley flower look the same, you start asking the question why. You know, little wild sorrel that was growing in places around the farm, lemon balm, anise, anise hyssop became one of my favorite herbs. The smell of that licorice in the wind was like I'll never forget it. I'll never
wow.
forget. I was like, what is that? And I didn't know what these things were. I saw them in cookbooks and I saw them, great chefs using product like this. But I was never able to work with it because it had to come from a farm. You had to have that farm attachment to the restaurant to get this lucky. I mean, there's nothing like, cilantro we've had a million times. Have you ever
Mhm,
had a cilantro flower? Have you ever had the green seed, the green coriander that
mm,
comes from that? And dissecting the plant and all of its, abilities and its versatility, I really became obsessed with that. Because every single one of those parts from the plant had something to offer in a plate of food.
mm,
So it just boom, it set in. It was one of the best decisions I ever made. It was a tangible thing, and I'm proud of myself for just going really to dirt as like an answer. Like
mhm,
it was an answer to all of my problems, and
right.
then I started to study it. So, you know, um, moving into biodynamics, right? Basically, we need to understand, its origin, and it came from Rudolf Steiner. There was basically a ton of monoculture that was going on at the time, especially corn, and they were noticing a big problem. These, entire fields were getting wiped out, low yields, barren soil. One of the first things that Mother Nature does to any ground is cover it with weeds, right? Cover it with plants. It does not like bare soil. Well, we were just so chemically induced with our soil and everything, nothing could grow. It was
Mm,
acidifying, and it was a really, really bad situation for not only just the farmers, but for the planet. So in comes Rudolf Steiner, who was just this. He was a character. He was a staunch Christian. He was a very, very Christian man, and he was considered a clairvoyant. I mean, much like what Temple Grandin was to cows, Rudolf Steiner was to plants,
mm,
and he basically created this synergistic cycle, and that one thing must be used for the other. And it was a beautiful and simple approach. Like, if you're going to grow plants, you have to grow plants for the livestock, and the livestock is going to produce you manures, which can feed your plants, right?
mhm,
Or create compost that can feed your plants. And he wanted to incorporate also vermiculture, some kind of worm food. So worm castings is the perfect food, the perfect not an edible, but the perfect food for plants.
for plants.
Um, and I love actually visiting worm farms and stuff like that. Castings, although can be expensive, are just is some of the best thing you can do for your garden. But he had these four, this synergistic cycle, right? And
So say that one. I didn't quite catch what you said after the vermiculture, and you said there was one other thing that was expensive.
so
That
it's vermiculture,
yeah,
plants,
yeah.
um, livestock, and then basically back again. And well, yourself, right? Because you're also your input not only in the garden, but your input in eating that garden and or eating your livestock as well. How that's being all created right in this cycle
Right.
is what completes it. And they implemented it immediately, and it started to work. It really started to work.
Mm.
Now on top of that, right, there were other things, and this is where his clairvoyance kind of came in, where we would focus on lunar cycles, when to plant, let's say, beets, or a brassica or something along those lines. There was a schedule to kind of adhere to. This was the coolest thing that we did on Love Apple Farms was there's a quartz, and there's a special quartz, and it should come from a specific mine, and I forget that mine. But you break it up into a powder and you add it to cold water, and then with a stick you agitate it by moving 360 degrees with your stick and creating a vortex in the water, right? By spinning that stick really, really quickly, really fast.
Mm.
And then you all of a sudden stop it. You stop it at 12 o'clock, the stick, and that disrupts the water, right?
Right.
And what this is supposed to emulate is the universe itself. Okay, the universe is it's a beautiful poetic thing. It's also like violent. Okay, it is catastrophic. It
Right.
is you know uh yeah, it's just a lot of bangs, right? And it's supposed to emulate that in some way. Um so, and when you're doing that, you're also supposed to think good thoughts, and which was hilarious because we had an infestation of um, cucumber beetle,
Ooh.
and we were killing like 180 a day,
Which
and
is
then
literally by hand.
by hand. Yeah, no, yeah, of course you have to go by hand. We had to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go out there, and the first thing we would hit were the calendulas. They loved nesting in calendula because it looks like them,
Right.
and they're smart, they're clever. It's camouflaged, but it doesn't fool the human. And 180 down, I remember we were thinking killing these cucumber beetle, and Cynthia was like, no, 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 good thoughts, you have to do good thoughts. And we're like, yeah, but just imagine this garden without any. Oh, what a beautiful garden. And it was hilarious. It was this fun exchange.
Fascinating.
So that is, I wanted to work at Manresa again, right?
Right.
Falling in love now with gardening, kind of changed that. But regardless, the day that I was going to talk to them, or the weekend that I was going to talk to them about a possible position, it was 4th of July weekend. The restaurant had burned down to the ground,
Oh,
and it was this it was a huge blow to, I thought, was going to be like my path,
right.
and working this 2 Michelin, now 3 Michelin environment with a chef that I really admire, and inspired by, in a garden that I now had a lot of input on, and Cynthia and I had a wonderful relationship. The restaurant had burned down, so
What a
um,
blow.
yeah, it was pretty incredible. But this went back to that first lesson at Antonello's. It's like you can't go back. You just gotta keep going. You gotta keep moving forward, moving forward.
Right.
And that's when I went to Seattle. I landed a job at Canlis Restaurant in Lake Union, which became probably the best cooking years of my life with the best craftsmen I've ever worked with.
Mm.
So Canlis was a special place. And this was actually the first place that I worked from my mentorship with Ian.
Mm.
So, it was time to apply the things that I had learned. And when I did, I was extremely successful. And I remember looking back at that and like, oh my God, like all of this, blood, sweat, and tears, it paid off. I'm like a rock star in the kitchen right now, and people are
Mm.
looking at me like, holy crap, this kid can cook. And I remember feeling really great about that. And that was another, like, one of those last, gifts from Ian, that I got. This rigorous training paid off,
Right.
and Canlis became really, really special. I was there for 2 years. I was there as a sous chef. I actually ended up kind of stepping back, and because I really wanted to be a baker. I didn't want to manage people or anything. I wanted to kind of finish off and round off my craft. And the one thing I didn't know yet was bread. And I took a step back. I was like, I really don't want sous chef anymore. I want to be a baker. They were cool with that, which is, and I was able to bake for 8 months and move forward again. Like, I had learned what I could learn from Canlis, and I had to move forward. Now, obviously, there's an echo of biodynamic farming now in the background, because I became really intrigued, and so I wanted to just see if I could turn our farm in Winlock into one.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, fast forward, we have this gorgeous 15 acres in Winlock, overlooking the two, Rainier and St. Helens. It's just one of the most amazing pieces of property when you think about energy, vibration, calmness, and centering. I think of that farm. I think of our land. It's a special place.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, like, one of the first days moving there, the universe of rainbow that started and stopped on the same property line, and I thought, like, wow, this is really, there's something really special here. And you had already done about 10 years, 15 years of kinder goats and creating your pedigree and all of this with animals. And so I knew that animals was already part of the farm. And Dad was very good on the tractor. He's very good at managing the stalls and keeping the compost pile turned. So it's funny, I just see these two things. I'm like, we can do this. We can do this. We were already organic. We were already looking, you know we were already, I mean, actually even ahead of organic. But we were there. We were already there. I just had to really implement a strategy when it came to planting, and the data with that, and a compost log. Um, and then we just had to have somebody come out and do a study of our soil. And his name, he was a really, I think his name was Daniel. He was just a really awesome guy from Demeter.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, there was two programs at the time, Stella and Demeter. And Stella meant, was really organics, and Demeter was biodynamics.
Right.
It didn't, if you had biodynamics, it clearly meant that you would also get Stella, so you would always apply for both. I think that that has changed now recently. Stella is no longer, um, you know, something you can get. Whether the foundation fell flat, I don't really know, or they just merged and just created Demeter as a whole, and Demeter certified us. So I spent about 4 months with back and forth application. It is an incredible amount of information that you need to give up to them to see if your practices are sound. So one of them was inputs. So one of the most important things is your inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Compost can salinate your soil, and basically you can only put so much compost per hectare. And so that was something I was kind of worried about. because we got all of our nutrition and everything from our stalls, from our compost, and that
Right.
would be our only dirt that we would use. So, but I was confident that our composting program was great, and the dirt that came from it was great, and um, that risk paid off. Soil tests are expensive, and it's really hard to kind of like, we have so many areas of the farm that were different. Like, how do you take all of these samples, and then not only that, like, how do you create like an input system, or program into those areas? We had an orchard, and we had berries, and then we had an incredible amount of nightshades over here, and brassicas over there. So all of those need nutrition, are different nutritionally,
Right.
and it
And
was
we built
difficult.
this all
So
from scratch.
yeah,
There was a
yeah,
barn and limited rustic fencing. Most of it was falling down. There was an old garden space, and one old kind of a equipment shed. But outside of that, we put all the fencing in. We made sure the animals were taken care of. We started to work on the garden, and you were instrumental in making sure that took off with the garden beds and whatnot.
yeah. I
Organic
remember, I
stuff.
remember kind of surveying the spot that the garden is now,
Mm-hmm.
with Dad, and I think that that was a great call on our part. It has just the slightest slope down,
Mm-hmm.
for just good drainage, but it was mostly flat, and we had a definite thistle issue, so we had to plant well. We obviously don't want to plant in a patch of that. It was really, I thought, a good call, from that. Um, but yeah, it then just becomes, you know, talking to Demeter, about what they want to see. I had mentioned inputs, as being a really big, like, cannot use any chemical fertilizer, clearly. They didn't even really like chicken manure. It
Mm.
had to be a specific source. And that source was like OMRI listed, and I believe biodynamic as well. So, and you can only use so much of that. Um, you had, there's obviously the manure had to be purchased from that one university. Gosh, this has been a while, so you have to bear with me, but there's like a biodynamic institute, and this is where you can get your quartz and you can get your fertilizer. One thing is the buried manure of a cow that is stuffed in its horn, and that manure you basically make like a compost tea out of, and that magical stuff, it is magical, had to be sprayed in the garden. So that you had to make sure that that was documented, how you did it, wonderful thoughts again, remember, and
Right.
go from there.
So
But so
talk to me a
inputs.
little bit about the like what you were hoping to see and what results you actually had from this process that you went through. You were able to get certified, and then
Yeah.
what were you hoping to see as a result in the garden or around the
Well,
property?
so that's a great question. So I am seeing this in the eyes of a chef, not as a gardener. And my whole idea was to create this like culinary Wonka land, okay?
Mhm.
Like an edible landscape, um, that was synergistic, and adhering to certain laws of biodynamic. This is what you have to kind of understand about biodynamics, is that you basically just pay attention differently. Okay, you know there's certain adherences because you are now tuning to certain things that maybe you didn't pay attention to before, like a pest issue, or like a nitrogen issue, or an NPK issue, um, so on and so forth. So, um,
You have
and
to be more
cooking is like
observant.
that. When you're cooking at a very high level, you're really paying attention to the details, right? The devil is in the details, and they matter.
Right.
Um, and that's what biodynamics gives, and that's why I actually loved it. Okay, it couldn't allow just anybody to just do what they wanted and put it under the umbrella of organics.
Right.
Um, and because one of the things is, a lot of people can get a Michelin star or get even biodynamics, but maintaining it is a different thing.
Right.
People lose their stars all the time, and I think that the practices just become um too much for a lot of farmers to continue on with biodynamics. So it's an interesting thing, and that's what, take some of these things that are important. And I think that the two most important things out of biodynamics is crop rotation and um, the cycle, the synergistic cycle. So having having worms on the farm, or having bees, giving bees, plenty of things to forage, and obviously you're going to have tons of food for worms. Having animals that, it's also, you're giving some of your crop to animals as well,
Hmm.
giving them a wonderful, like, vegetarian diet that way, and that all coming back to you through slaughter, through harvest, doesn't matter. It completes the cycle. I thought that that was really one of the most important things I took out of it.
Right.
Um, but what I was hoping to see was, was really, so two things, was a control of that synergy, some kind of um ability to create efficiency,
Hmm.
because that was one of probably the hardest thing to manage on any farm. But biodynamics is a whole other level, because there's just so much information that you need to be giving Demeter at any given time. So you were cataloging everything, and it took a large part of your day. Um, that was one thing, but um, the other was, again, just creating this culinary oasis.
Right.
Thirdly, I mean, it was probably economically, right? Or fiscally speaking, you can you can get more for a biodynamic product. I mean, end of story. There are stories of people selling even biodynamic eggs for $30 a dozen,
Right.
which is so absurd, in my opinion, and not what it's about. I it's this is why it's probably the third thing. You know, Being successful on a farm is just a byproduct of the three things that you really talk about in Pivot to Pasture, and having, the skill or the market, or knowledge, right? If you're not having those things, I mean, becoming successful on a farm is when all three of those things are balanced, and the byproduct of that is that you are just successful enough to start another year, and famously, Jean Fortier, um, he's like, we got 40 seasons to get it right before I'm too tired to move on, and I love that, right? It's like we
Right.
got 40 tries here, guys,
Right.
and I looked at it the same. Like every year there was just an improvement, and that it was paying off. Rudolph talks about how it takes about 7 years, to see the effect um, of what you're doing to your microsystem, your little micro ecology. It's climate. So that's that's pretty much it. I wanted to fund the fun in a way. I thought biodynamics could get me that reputation, that, I feel like we certainly deserved, because of your practices with the livestock, and this incredible just line of breed that we were, so focused on. It would just bring attention to the farm, because it really becomes a thing about, um, growing for your family, growing food for your family, and knowing what to do with it, is equally important. You can grow 1,000 pounds of tomatoes, but if you don't have a good sauce, it's
Right.
or you don't have the patience, or maybe even the resources. Like, I mean, imagine that's probably 100 bowl jars. I mean, are you
Right.
ready to take on, that kind of chore? And on top of that, like, especially for biodynamics, um, you know, to get everything labeled, with our name and everything as well. Hard thing to do, and just stay on top of. You there?
Yeah, glad to get you back. I lost you there for a moment. So we were just talking about, what your vision was for biodynamic, what you were hoping to get out of it, and then what you actually saw after applying all of these principles. So let's keep the conversation going. Keep telling me all that goodness.
So, there was the synergy was really important for me, right? And that, you and I mean, I remember going to a bee class and learning, all about bees, and, that was a fun time. But, how to utilize also, that incredible animal to our advantage in the garden. Again, in line with this synergy of vermiculture, animal, plants, human, that was important for me.
Mhm.
But really, I mean, for a chef standpoint, it was about creating this culinary oasis, this culinary wonkaland, um, and with taste being the driver. I will never forget being at Love Apple, and we had gotten our first harvest of ground cherries. It was Cape Mary gooseberries.
Mm.
And you harvest them actually as they fall. You never harvest them on the plant. It's whatever's fallen you can harvest and or is ripe and ready to go.
Mhm.
But there was a kind of warmth, a sun-kissed warmth, and almost, yeah, sun cooked, and a brick level, a sugar level so high, it blew my mind how good this little ground cherry was.
For anyone who
And
has never had a ground cherry, you have to describe it.
it is like from the tomatillo, it's like a tomatillo family, but it's a berry that has a calic, and it is a small plant. I think Mary's has a Cape gooseberry, or Cape Mary's something. If I remember from
Aunt
Johnny's or
Molly,
some,
I think, is the Aunt
or
Molly's.
Aunt Molly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Aunt Molly. There's a great varietal. But it's a bush, and, a small one. You can just, put a couple tomato cages around them so they can grow a little taller,
You can get
and
under
drop
them.
their fruit. Yeah, and you can get right under them. They love heat. They love warm roots. So,
Mhm.
you can tarp them as well.
They are
And
prolific. We still have
prolific.
volunteers every year, and it's awesome to be able to walk through the garden and pick those little pouches of this incredible goodness.
Yeah, those are special. And
It's like
so being,
tropical,
yeah, yeah, I mean, definitely. Just, I mean, it's from that nightshade, that tomato family. So,
but it
tropical for
doesn't taste
sure.
like a tomato at all.
Not at all. It has that, it has those
Fruity.
typical seeds. Um, but yeah, being being taste driven, like I was talking about with just cilantro, you know, when you're trying the green coriander, when you're trying the flowers of all of these plants, um, it and the freshness of it, you know, you no transportation, no place can get that kind of quality to any restaurant unless the restaurant has a garden.
Right.
And obviously, if my dream was to open a restaurant, then clearly, you know, it was important for me to have that. That's what makes the restaurant special.
Hmm.
You know, how many times have you ever been served a cilantro flower? But yet,
Never.
how many never? And how many times have you eaten cilantro though? I mean, once a week. I mean, it's in every restaurant, right?
Mhm.
And so it was cool to see, you know, more of the plant, what it has to offer. And that's what I really wanted to start bringing to the farm.
I
I did
remember
want
having
to
chive flowers, how
chive
incredible
flower.
those are.
Yeah, yeah.
And like
Nasturtium.
edible flowers like nasturtium and some of the other, Johnny jump ups and those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. The the edible landscape. I mean, you and I dream about that, and have talked about it all the time. You know, we're only growing things that produce food.
Hmm.
That's important. Or fixes soil, right? Or is a nitrogen fixer. That's really important as well. Um, but clearly moving more into a perennial, was the idea. There's only so many annuals I wanted to do every year. And I also just wanted to, like, what kind of chef was I going to be? I mean, Love Apple, well, is an old name for a tomato, and she was a tomato grower. She specialized in tomatoes, and that market was already done, you know. And again, I was also against moving into some kind of like monoculture popularity,
Right.
you know, for the sake of money, or that I'm just good at it. I want to be great at a lot of things, you know, and challenge myself that way. It's a very chef thing to do. And so one of my things was like implementing a tea garden. I loved the idea
I
of
remember that.
um, growing, basically having like um, an herb garden, but obviously shaped into some kind of Fibonacci sequence, and picking and drying and creating my own Tisan teas. You know, I still want that to this day.
Hmm.
Um, but it really wanted to. It's infrastructure. It is animal husbandry.
Hmm.
Um, it is um, utilizing the resources. It is making the most out of the harvest. And
Right.
what does that look like? You know, was it processing? Was it bottling? Was it farmers market? Was it more like fresh to table?
Hmm.
Was it an outlet that, was like a 10 or 20 person a night special kind of reserve dinner?
Hmm.
So, those were all ideas, but it still starts with growing really efficiently, for taste. That's
Right.
really what it becomes.
I like
And how to do that, you know? So, yeah, I love food.
that. So, if you have one tip that you want to share, um, with anyone who is listening to this, what's that one tip that you could share? Um,
Oh,
whether it's
gosh.
about biodynamic or whether it's about like you've made a couple of really significant moves. What's one thing that you learned from that whole process?
Um, I don't, whether you're in a city or you're out, in the land with acreage, growing food is a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
Putting seeds in the ground, and tending to that crop until it bears you that reward is a beautiful thing, you know, and I encourage everyone to do that. But patience is a virtue. And one of my favorite things to like, my favorite pastimes is to learn what other market gardeners, which is essentially what I was becoming, what other market gardeners are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And there's one gentleman in New York in the Catskills with Never Sink Farms. His name is Connor Crickmore. And everyone probably knows about this guy by now because he has one of the most successful farms in the nation. This guy is on 2 acres of cultivars, is making about $300,000 a year, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone wants to know his recipe for success. And one of the things that he talks about is actually not doing anything with your land the first year,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to see what what rain looks like on it, what wind looks like on it, where the weeds are, what can be fenced, what you know, and you know, you have to be observant.
Right.
And I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because actually, you know, on our farm, Dad and I were observant of where that garden was going to go first. You know what I mean? And it paid off, and that was really, really important. So sit back and really just try and understand your land. Like, where's your water draining? How can you capture that water? Which plants love it in that water bog? Which plants don't?
Mm-hmm.
And really having a, you know, a topographical layout of your farm is the most important thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, you are planning and just like cooking, like mise en place, right? To put into place everything that you need to cook something well. You know, gardening is like that. You know, if you're going to have a Jane Cedar, you're going to have a power harrow or something. You know, they have like those things that have like a drill attached. You know, certain tools now for minimal tilth. You know,
Right.
um, inputs. Are you going to be a raised bed guy? You need to start building raised beds. If you're not, you got to start thinking about wood chips and mycorrhizal inputs. You know, using Remiol chips and things like that from young trees. Um,
Talk to
where
me
is
about mise
your
en place, for anyone who doesn't know what that is.
mise en place to put into place,
Ah,
right? So that's and that is your preparation. Okay,
I think
everything
that's
is
kind of the pivot to pasture plan. I want
yeah,
to take a tie into that.
mise en place, mise en place, mise en place.
I love
You
it.
know, planning and thinking ahead,
Right.
right? And having that vision for it.
Right.
But they're just like any craft and and anything, it's a lot depends on your tools, and that kind of sucks, right? Like you have to acquire quite a bit of tools, okay, to make the job more user friendly, more just, you know, fun to do, but also just to pull off, you
Right.
know. Um, just think about harvest equipment. You know, there's so much out there, and washing it and storing it in like a cool bot walk-in. Like, are all of those things in line before you grow the first seed, like before you grow your first plant? You
Right.
know, and that is what's important. People want to just put stuff in the ground immediately, and they're not thinking. You should have the first thing is a soil sample of where you think your garden is going to go, and then observe that land for a year. Now, I really believe in what's called occultation, and that is to tarp over your garden area for
What is
the
it called and how do
entirety
you
of
spell it?
occultation, OCCULTA, TION.
I'll look that up.
Um,
Thank you.
and that is to basically tarp your land.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is you actually till it, you kind of disturb the soil, you break it up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What I would do is actually use um, a deep, not a plow. Why can't I think of it? Like a deep, well, it's like a deep plow, but you're not inverting the soil.
Mm.
So it's a single tine, um, plow, but doesn't invert the soil, and it goes about 2 feet deep. That's extremely important to break up the hard pan that has, just from root systems and things like that, but rain really created that hard pan. So you need to break that up. That's the
Mm.
first order of business. Second order of business, because now you're going to have a weed issue, right? Because you just disturbed soil. And
Right.
what does Mother Nature like to do with bare soil? It likes
Wants
to
to
cover
cover
it
it.
up, right? You are tricking her by putting the tarp. So
Right.
what's going to happen is that the weeds are going to pop up in that tarp, but sunlight will kill them with, or the void, without the sunlight will kill them.
Right.
So now you have this blank canvas,
Right.
right? That you would then put 4 inches of, compost or some good soil that you need to be finding in your area. Believe me,
Hmm.
that is a lot harder said than done.
Right.
Finding a good guy with good soil, or good compost. And then wood chips. I absolutely believe in wood chips as a walkway, not as a mix up like that one guy does. That one
Right.
Christian man, really good. He's a good dude. And I do love wood chips if you had a pile of them, and you just let it degrade for 3 years,
Right.
um, but it's wood chips as a walkway will create a mycorrhizal network that your garden needs. I mean, would really benefit from, um, and go from there. Then you have really just become a no-till weed somewhat free environment, the best possible weed free environment if you stay on top of it with like a harrow.
Nice.
Um, and that is the way to go. Occultation, absolutely. And two guys talk about this a lot. So Connor Crickmore is one of them. Fortier is one of them, but another one that I really love is Richard Perkins of Making Small Farms Work, and he's out of Sweden. This guy, in 3 month growing season, okay, pulls it off with an incredible garden. But he also does poultry, and I really believe in poultry. Um, in its fertilizer, but also what it does to pasture. It's a good economical first animal that you should have on the farm.
Right.
And moving into other things like that. But Richard Perkins, of Ridgedale Farm in Sweden,
Okay.
awesome individual. He has like hundreds of videos
I'm going to
about
put
how he
links
does things.
to a bunch of the people that you mentioned in our time together.
Yeah.
Oh, speaking of which, I've kept you for a really long time, and I really appreciate all of this incredible
I love talking about it.
perspective. And I know we could continue for another hour or more.
We
Um,
could. I had
so
to cook
please,
dinner though.
can we please continue the conversation? We'll see what people want to hear more about, and we can always dive deeper into some of these topics that we touched on today. I mean, you
Yeah,
really scratched.
sharing this knowledge is
Yeah.
is where it starts, and I'm really passionate about that. I in cooking, chefs didn't really give up their recipes until they earned it. I was quite the opposite. I couldn't wait to give them their recipes and see what they do with it. Young cooks these days, and it's the same for gardening. I love sharing like what I know, and what I know is minimal, but it's a start. And moving into these categories of compost, pest control, inputs, animal husbandry. I mean, there's so much to talk about in this amazing, this topic.
Yeah.
And I love that Pivot to Pasture is that platform. I'm really proud of this voice. Anthony Bourdain was our voice for the kitchen,
Yeah.
and he was powerful, powerful, in that industry. And that's just the power of voice, and that's the power of communicating, these things to others and getting
Yeah.
people interested. That's the goal, right? So I'm really
I'm
excited for the future holds, and I'm here for you guys for sure.
awesome. I'm going to share one of your recipes I found online, by the way, for the garganelli pasta with spring peas, pearl onions, and pancetta. I
That's a
might
good
be
start.
obsessed with garganelli. Yum.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
So,
it is quite simply shallots, garlic, olive oil, and peas blended up. You know, you have to render some guanciale or pancetta, but to serve it with garganelli, I think Rusticella has a very good garganelli brand
oh,
of pasta. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck making it, and I'm not giving up my pasta dough just yet.
well,
Okay.
there's one online.
Oh, there is. Oh, all right.
Yes.
Oh, then Google me. I forgot that I'm Googleable. Oh my God, I'm so famous.
Well, I look
Um,
forward to our next conversation. I know you have to run, and
you as well.
I'll put links to the things that we talked about. We'll continue the conversation.
Perfect.
And with that, thanks, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Sounds good.
All right.
All right. Bye now.
Bye for now.